Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who has joined us virtually today from different regions. And thank you everyone for joining in for the session, Indigenous People and Forests, a Symbiosis for Conservation and Development. This is the second edition of the Bhutan Regional Forum, and we were fortunate to host a first successful one earlier this year in the month of January in association with the Tata Steel Foundation and the Bhutan Institute of Himalayan Studies. The forum helped us understand community-based ecosystems, stories from forest people, and the importance of the Gross National Happiness Index in the country. The successes of this forum allowed us to meet today to take this discussion to the next level. Bhutan is a unique country, rare in its policy of putting nature first. It is the global leader in exemplifying ecology is economy, with about 72.5% of its land covered by forests. While the forests play a crucial role, the region's commitment in preserving its biodiversity is also firmly rooted in the understanding of the importance of the forest ecosystem for communities. Today, we want to understand this symbiotic relationship between forests, people, and the rich natural resources the country holds. Our session today will be moderated by Dr. Sonam Wangyel. Dr. Wangyel is a research professor and a socio-environmental scientist with special interest in understanding the fundamentals of the human-environmental interface and the impact of climate change on this relationship to guide policy decisions. He also worked for the Royal Government of Bhutan as the head of national parks and as the director of the Bhutan Royal Education Council. In addition, he has worked as a consultant to multiple national and international agencies. He is joined today by Dr. Pema Choephyel, the former CEO of the Bhutan Trust Fund for Environmental Conservation, with a rich professional background in agriculture and forest management research, and is now funding with many projects related to forests and community development. Dr. Katel is a faculty member of the College of Natural Resources at the Royal University of Bhutan, where he teaches climate change adaptation and natural resources management. His research interests include land use change, ecosystem services, and community livelihoods. Dr. Katel is a visiting researcher at the Nagoya University in Japan. He is currently serving as a Dean of Research and Industrial Linkages at the College of Natural Resources at the Royal University of Bhutan. Dr. Jeremy Brooks is a professor in the School of Environment and Natural Resources at Ohio State University. He is affiliated with the Environmental and Social Sustainability Lab and the Sustainable and Resilient Economy Discovery Theme at OSU. Dr. Brooks conducted his PhD research in Bhutan in 2005 and 2006 and has published several papers related to natural resource management, environmental conservation, and sustainable development in Bhutan. Ugyen Namgyel is the head of the Nature Conservation section in Bumthang Forest Division, Bhutan. He has extensively engaged in research work in embracing interior zoning paradigm for scientific wildlife management interventions, effective waste management along the highway, involving pertinent conservation partners in Bhutan's Phumsengla National Park, Ecological Survey, and more. He has also authored and co-authored various publications and has 21 published titles under his name. We welcome each one of you. May I now request our moderator for the session, Dr. Sonam Wangyel, to open the session.
Thank you, Joanna, for your kind introduction, and Balabria Foundation and Karishma for this organization. And I also want to thank all the expert panelists for your time and commitment and working through the hours to be here this morning here in Asia and night in the US. The theme for today's session, as Joanna rightly mentioned, is Indigenous People and Forest, a Symbiosis for Conservation and Development. The session will have two rounds, and round one will be on situational assessment, and round two on options and alternatives taking forward. So without further ado, I would like to set the context for the session. And whether we talk about Native Americans or the Nagas of Northeastern India or the Monpas in Bhutan, there is one common trait that dissects across all, and that is that they were, they are, and they will be the best keepers of our forest. All our ancestors have once belonged to an indigenous or a tribal group and have handed over beautiful forests endowed with rich biodiversity to us. However, as we all know, this symbiotic relationship between forests and people have started to degenerate, with indigenous groups being either removed from forests or forest ownership being taken over by the state in many parts of the world for sustainable forest management per se. Yet, as we know, these actions have not achieved its objective. Without its original stewards, the indigenous people, forests today are quickly disappearing from the surface of this earth. Today, actually, according to WWF, forests of a size of a football field is being destroyed every second. Bhutan, a small remote country locked up in the eastern Himalayas, has also seen its own share of changes in this relationship. I'd like to take this opportunity to share my personal experience to illustrate this a bit. I was born and raised in a remote village in Bhutan where I spent the first 10 years of my life helping my parents do agriculture. Our village is about 4 hours of walking distance from the nearest motor road. During these years, I've seen how lives of the people in the villages were intertwined with forest. Forest then were my playground, wildlife my cartoon channel, the clean streams from where I drink fresh water. We did not have electricity back then, telephones or television shows, but we were happy. Life back then was a simple and honest partnership between nature and us, one of give and take based on mutual trust. We took firewood, water, leaf litter, wood, timber, etc. Giving was simply in the form of livestock losses to predators and crops to herbivores. However, over the last 40 years of my life, I have observed that this otherwise simple symbiotic relationship has undergone observable changes, mostly triggered by two factors. Number one, policy changes. Bhutan forest was nationalized in the 1960s, which transferred the ownership of the forest from local communities to the central government. This was the first step in severing the relationship between local communities and their forests in Bhutan. The next major change came with establishment of national parks, which imposed stricter restrictions on resource use and affected traditional accesses. The second factor is the economic development that not only monetized forest resources, but also increased access to it through motorable roads. This accelerated the rate of extraction for profits legally or illegally. The outcome is very simple. We have created a system that has attempted to alienate traditional custodians of forests from their forests, which resulted in loss of stewardship, increased human-wildlife conflicts, increased frequency of disasters such as forest fire, and opportunist behavior to extract resources for income, even illegally. Yet, despite all these challenges, today, Bhutan, in my opinion, still maintains a fair relationship between forests and people and can become a learning center for others around the world. So with this, I would like to get right into the session of round one. My first question is then for Dr. Pema, the ex-CEO of Bhutan Trust Fund. Sir, given your long experience in both forest, agriculture, livestock, academia, what are your thoughts about changes people and forest interactions and its impact on future relationship between forests or natural resources and forest-dependent people in Bhutan?
Thank you, Dr. Wangyel. I think good morning to everyone of the panel here. I'm really humbled to have been called as a panelist to this session. Well, I think much of the things have been said by you in the introductory remark. To me, I think the relationship has seen phases in their life between people and the forest. First, and from ancient times, probably, people have been interdependent with each other for a long, long time. And people have always been integrated with nature. People had a sense of care for nature and committed to protect the nature. However, over the times, we have seen that changes have occurred, probably due to the changes in our behavior and our way of living. So what has happened is when we moved from subsistence to semi-commercial to commercial farming, I think the probably I wouldn't like to say, we'll use the word greed, but for people to sustain themselves, for people to get much better of the things from the forest, they have tried to exploit the forest. I think that is where I think we have gone wrong as a human being. Forgetting the symbiotic relationship, we have really devastated, degraded our forest in the past. However, in context to Bhutan, the constitution, as it spells out that Bhutan should maintain 60% of its forest for all years to come, has helped quite a lot. And I would also like to agree on what what Dr. Wangyel said, that change of policy from community ownership to state ownership has a bearing on how the relationship had deteriorated over the years. People felt really restricted to access the resources that were available to them. And then they tried to either poach or either do illegal aspects so that they can meet their ends meet. So what has really happened is there was rather disjointedness that had developed over the years. And even if you look at global aspects, you will see that people, because of industrializations, because of development, wanted to have more comfortable life, more extractions went in, more exploitation of forests went in, and then the more people tried to seek the comfort, the more exploitations had occurred over times. So the relationship has really deteriorated. What had happened with during this time was also the corporate sectors coming in and trying to meet the people's change habits and change living standards. We were just making corporates to benefit out of the forest-people relationship. And this is something we should really look at and see how this can improve over the times. And the impact of what this had was the high amount of pollutant, high amount of garbage being produced because of the changing habits and behavior of our people and their wants. So therefore, these are three critical things that I think we should really look into. And the impact that has occurred is the pollutions of the environment, choking of our river systems due to the floating garbages, rise in temperature, leading to glacier melts and natural weather pattern, change in natural weather patterns. Having said that, Bhutan has not really suffered, and government in a quest to intervene has also tried to give stewardship to communities through a community forestry management systems. And I think that has really toned down to the extent of exploitations in Bhutan to our natural resources. To that effect, when I was in heading the research in Bhutan, we also delisted one of the very important commercial crop from natural resources, that is cordyceps, and that has helped to balance things out, of course, with the stricter regulations for that matter of how you harvest, timing of harvesting of cordyceps, and so on. And like that, I think there are lots of non-wood forest products that needs to be taken care of. And now Parifolia is one thing. So what, to me, I think the relationship can be re-established. Policies needs to be changed. We should not say that forest needs to be protected, but I think what we need to come up with policies or regulations where conservation and utilization goes hand in hand. I think that is, very critical for us to really look into it and see how it can, the symbiotics can be re-established in the long run. Lastly, I would like to say that a good leadership is very important in any of our efforts that we do. And for that, Bhutan had been blessed with the top leadership from our monarchs, especially the fourth king, who had been a pioneer in protecting and conserving the natural resources of Bhutan. So to me, I think we have to re-establish the biophilia that had been existing in the past, forgotten in the present, but in future, that is something that we should really look at and see. So the impact is enormous, as everybody knows, because climate change is the buzzword these days. So therefore, I think this is something that will have to be changed. And otherwise, if you don't do that, I think the symbiosis will be lost, and people will be highly impacted, especially the indigenous and people who are highly dependent on forest resources. Thank you, Dr. Wangyel.
Thank you, sir. And without further ado, I'd like to ask the second question, which is to Dr. Katel, who is a professor at College of Natural Resources, Royal University of Bhutan. Sir, over the years, changes in policy, environment, and socio-economic settings have changed to some extent the way people respond to these changes. For instance, water shortages due to deforestation. As a professor in resources, what are your thoughts about what are the significant changes, their causes, and how people and nature are responding to this change? Is this change good or bad for the symbiotic relationship?
Thank you, Dr. Wangyel, for the nice introduction. And this is a very big question. I don't know where I should start. I was finding a little difficult time to get the entry point and then start talking about this policy change, environmental change, and economic benefits. But having said that, I would like to pick up what you have said earlier, that I think broadly, when you look at the policy perspective, there are at least three changes that happened in Bhutan. And then Dr. Pema rightly pointed out that for the good outcome of any policies and then its implementation, I think the leadership counts. And then with the visionary leadership in Bhutan, we have these significant changes. And then I would like to again pick up from Dr. Wangyel's the first policy is nationalization of the resources in 1960s. And then that's the significant change, because I think before that, it was basically the community used to manage these resources. And maybe I should say this. One of the professors asked me, what big changes can I see when you talk about nationalization in 1960s, and how can I understand that the nationalization happened in 1960s, and then after that, there are so many changes, and then how that nationalization brought changes to Bhutan. And then I told him that if you just go around in Bhutan and then nearby villages and around the roadsides, if you just look at, rarely you would see very old trees. And these trees are 40 years, 50 years old. And then that shows that there used to be a resources exploitation, I should say exploitation before 1960s. And then probably there are other factors, but my own opinion is that there used to be resource exploitation before 1950s. And then after 1950s, so that's the reason that the government has nationalized this policy and then brought the decision making to the center. That's the big change. And after that, as Dr. Wangyel mentioned, that there is a strict implementation of the nature conservation policies. Excuse me. And when you talk about resources management and environmental conservation, environmental preservation, Bhutan had actually started with the forest conservation policies, because the realization is that when there is forest, the pollution of the soil, water pollution, and then air pollution can be taken care. I think this realization was already there because of the fact that Bhutan is a mountainous terrain country. So that was the first change, nationalization, strict implementation of the conservation policies. And then second change happens sometimes in 1970s to 1990s, where there was a bit of collaborative approaches. And the third big changes was in 1990s. If you just look at the histories of the conservation policies in Bhutan, most of the protected areas are actually so to say, not really designated, but they were made legal protected areas after 1990s. So history says that most of these protected areas were, and then resources management, resources use, the policies, rules, and regulations came up after 1990s. And then after 1995 to 2000, there was some change because rest of the world started fishing into this, three things actually: exclusionary land management, development of tourism, and conservation, and how to justify this conservation on religious and cultural grounds. So the first one is when protected areas were declared, then the land management, the taking into account of the rights of indigenous communities were actually excluded. And then that was the first experience the Bhutan learned. Next one was when tourism was actually declared, started sometimes in 1990s in major part of the world. And then Bhutan has realized that this tourism is actually creating tensions between the groups that bring tourists to the communities and the livelihood of the communities, because most of the cases that talks about the tourism actually doesn't really benefit the communities in most of the cases. And this Bhutan has realized that when tourism comes in, it has to contribute a little bit to the community's livelihood and substantially to the conservation of the environment in the protected areas. And then the third one is now when the conservation policies are implemented, then how can we justify based on the cultural grounds, based on the religious grounds, so that people would actually understand, and then they would actually become the stewardship of the nature. So that was the big realization. And then after 2000, actually, we can see that there is a big changes in communities in terms of the resources used, in terms of the beliefs, in terms of the eagerness to protect the conservation. So there are 3 phases, and then there were 3 issues, and then 3 phases is the nationalization, and then the collaborative approach, and then after that, community-based management. I would say it is a little bit extended models now than the community-based resource management. But these are 3 phases. And in 3 phases, what government has realized is that I would like to repeat this: exclusionary land management issues, development of tourism, and then the conservation, justification of conservation based on the religious and cultural grounds. These were the 3 changes took place in terms of the policy. And in terms of environment, briefly to talk about, when you look at this in the temperature change, precipitation change in 1990s to 2010, and then the 2017. I'm just looking at this one of the publications, recent publications on environmental change in Bhutan. And then this talks about there is a significant change in snow glaciers, there is significant change in forest. And then during this time, the realization is that when there is significant change in glacier coverage, there is also change in forest coverage, which means forest coverage increase based on the conservation policies, but based on the temperature change, the glacier has changed. And then there is now people are realizing that this too is actually highly correlated, which means one is increasing, another one is decreasing. And then this has actually, the change in temperature is affecting people, and then this increase in forest coverage is actually benefiting people. And this realization is happening in the villages. So that's briefly about environmental change. And then on the socioeconomic front, in view of the tenuous mountainous country, the soil erosion happens by itself. Theory says that we don't need to do anything. This happens in nature, but with the activity of people, when in the terrain, the soil erosion increases. And then with increasing forest coverage, people in the rural areas, especially the indigenous communities, they have realized that they have better access to the NTFs, which means non-timber forest products. And then the forest food production systems in the rural areas has increased because they can actually collect more leaf litter. And then this has actually changed over the years. So probably I'm running out of time, so I'd like to stop there.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ram. And so let's go directly to the third speaker, Mr. Ugyen Namgyel, who is a natural resource management expert. So I'd like to ask you, a community-based natural resource management specialist, what are some of the actual examples of symbiotic relationship existing between people and nature or forests today? Why do you think they survive to this day, and what are the potential threats to this relationship?
Okay, thank you, Doctor. Thank you so much. It is really an interesting question, but always difficult to get a right answer. Yet then I will try to share the experience that I have been observing and the knowledge that I have gained over the last 22 years of my service under the Department of Forest and Park Services. Well, as you are very much aware about this, in the case of Bhutan, religion has been playing a strong and influential role in the symbiotic relationship of people in nature, and it does now also. For instance, people believe in sacred groups and helps in conservation of trees, water sources, lakes, etc. Interconnectivity between forests, wild animals, and farmers is very exemplary in terms of food and shelter requirement. Without human interference, both at the canopy and ground layer, the optimal requirement of food is not readily available in the forest for wild animals and our cattle. In contrast, undisturbed forests are in fact rarely used by wild ungulates due to unpalatable forages. Rather, herbivores in particular prefer the forest edge around the agriculture field where there are abundant foods. Therefore, the existing practice of fragmented shifting cultivation or slash and burning at a minimal scale helps in improving forest health, thereby preventing the pests and disease, the parasitic plants and exotic weeds. And the third one is like timber and fiber collection sporadically by farmers at a smaller scale creates opening at the canopy and subsequently facilitates the growth of plant species on the ground layer. Similarly, a collection of leaf litters by farmers helps in controlling the humus layer and prevent fire hazards, and it also facilitates seed germination. And while the adverse effect of grazing is actually resounded in alpine meadows, the warm, broad-leaved and temperate forests, if unexploited by the cattle, obviously is not a good home for wild ungulates as well as for our local cattle. Therefore, the grazing and browsing by cattle that is owned by our farmers in the rural areas results in maintaining the annual growing cycle of palatable plants for wild animals and cattle themselves. A collection of non-wood forest products like bamboo and rattan by farmers helps in controlling colonizations of woodland by some aggressive bamboo and rattan species. Existing practice of joint or private forest resource management improves the health of the forestry and understory, and it also helps in preventing fire hazards and indiscriminate felling of timber. And this is what I can share, some of the examples about the symbiotic relationship of people and the nature in Bhutan. And the next question, if I'm to answer, is like, why symbiotic relationship between people and nature survive in Bhutan today? It's because of the fact that there's a strong love of people, their respect, and have an attachment and ownership of their local forest, which has been inherited from forefathers, though it is owned by the state government. It is because rural economic characteristics are ingrained in the existing religious practice. In this way, the materialistic desire of rural people is controlled to match our limited resources and people's lifespan by the Buddhist philosophy. For this reason, people enjoy the subsistence farming in the rural areas, and their subsistence farming practices are well connected with natural resources. My third answer to this is like the policy support that envisage balancing the natural environment conservation, economic development, and preservation of culture is one reason. All these three pillars of the four that are enshrined in GNH philosophy are carefully woven in every 5 years planning of the state government in Bhutan. Coming to the third question, like what are the potential threats to this symbiotic relationship? Yes, when there are some good relationship surviving regarding the relationship of people and the nature, there are some potential threats. And few examples are like degeneration in the religious beliefs or disintegration of religion from the rural economy can be one potential factor in the future. Protection or conservation-centric law, policy, and rules is one factor that can also be a potential threat to the relationship of people and nature. In a way that if the rules are very stringent and people's rights over inherited resource use are restricted. And the third potential threat could be like rural urban migration may lead to an increasing number of educated lots who keep exploring the job in the urban areas, and this may result in interaction gap between people and forest. When there is a gap, interaction gap between people and forest, then I think there is going to be a problem in nature itself. So there should be a kind of intervention or reaction between people and forest. This is what I see. And the last one is like a rapid change in the rural economy on the cost of nature is another factor. That is not exception to Bhutan. So this is what I have been observing, and this is what I have experiencing over the last 22 years of my service in the conservation sector. And if there are some that I have never come, I haven't able to come up, I will request my two panelists from Bhutan to supplement on this line. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you again for your expert opinion on the community and their relationship with forest. And Dr. Jeremy Brooks, my final question for round one. You are not only a community-based natural resource management specialist, but actually have some research experience from Bhutan. So can you share your views on relationship between community and natural resources in Bhutan?
Sure. First, I want to thank you, Dr. Wangyel, for inviting me to join this panel. It's really been an honor and pleasure to contribute to this discussion, or it will be an honor to contribute to this discussion and to learn from the responses that my Bhutanese colleagues have already provided. So in response to the question, I wanted to start a little bit broadly, both because I think it's important to give a sense of my worldview, but also because I'm less knowledgeable about natural resource management in Bhutan than the rest of the panelists. I can draw from some of the experiences I had from doing research there, but I'll put that in the context of sort of my broader set of knowledge on community-based resource management. So I see natural resource management as largely involving social dilemmas that require cooperation and collective action to solve at multiple scales. When there's a shared resource, I think there's a need to find some balance between the short-term interests of individuals and households and the long-term needs of other resource users in the community. And so in that context, I think that this concept of community is critical. And I'm using that word community to capture things like trust and reciprocity and shared norms and values and shared identity. And to link that then with this broader understanding that researchers have developed and practitioners that indicates that, you know, as it's been alluded to by all of the panelists already, that, you know, communities with certain characteristics in the right contexts and given the right sort of sets of rights and responsibilities can manage resources sustainably. But in the course of listening to the other responses from all the other panelists, I came to realize that as I was putting some notes together for my response, all of my thoughts were around human communities and relationships within those human communities, and not at all about how expanding the notion of community to the natural world. And I think that reflects my American bias in how I think of things and in the way I was sort of brought up, is that that's an important gap in my worldview, is that it's not automatic for me to see myself as part of a natural community the way either many indigenous societies do, or even just people who live in, you know, more direct contact with the natural environment. And so I do think that expanding that notion of community and focusing on the relationships between people and the environment is something that also should be incorporated in this thinking. So just following on sort of the importance of communities in natural resource management, I think that from my understanding and my own research is that when communities have been successful, it's often because local level institutions and norms and customs and traditions have been developed over long periods of time based on traditional knowledge systems and practices. And this has often sort of happened free of external pressures or sort of economic impacts on resources. Or it's because communities have put in a lot of hard work collectively to develop new institutions and new rules for resource management, and that they've been supported in that by local or state governments or NGOs. And I don't think that that's any different in Bhutan. I think actually Bhutan's a great example of how all of these dynamics have come together in terms of traditional practices, religious belief systems, government support, and community sort of characteristics and dynamics. Bhutan's a great example of how community-based resource management can work well in certain contexts. So given that sort of worldview, I tend to come from a school of thought that favors decentralized approaches to natural resource management, at least in certain conditions. And this, I think, is much like the policy that Bhutan has had in place for the last couple of decades in terms of how they view forest management and non-timber forest product management. I think a decentralized approach can be more fair and just for local communities. It could potentially be more efficient, maybe more likely to provide economic and social and environmental benefits to local communities. But I think all of that, all of those outcomes only happen when you have strong communities that are willing to sort of maintain traditional institutions or develop new institutions for resource management. And I want to avoid falling into the trap of expecting that every community is well positioned to solve collective action problems and to manage resources sustainably. And I think this is true everywhere, including Bhutan, that in cases where maybe there's an absence of leadership, and Dr. Pema mentioned the importance of leadership within communities, or there are heterogeneous values and interests, or there are power struggles and unfairness and inequities within communities, that can lead to challenges with resource management. So while I think communities are an ideal scale for resource management, so they're large enough to be effective, but small enough to be manageable, at least for certain resources, I think it's also important to approach community resource management with sort of an open mind and recognize that any case of community-based management, even the cases that are most well-functioning and successful, I think will probably require continual attention and maintenance and adaptation to changing internal and external conditions and contexts. And all of the panelists and the last speaker, Dr. Ugyen, just mentioned the importance of certain changing conditions and how those can impact resource management and environmental conditions. So I just want to end my response with one additional thought, and it's something that I can link to in the next round of questions, which is the idea that while CBNRM, community-based management, is a laudable goal and can be valuable for resource management, I think it also can be a long and difficult process. So even when you have a strong desire for local management and control, in cases where resource management hasn't been part of the community's sort of sphere of governance, and the rights and responsibilities for resource management, they maybe shouldn't just be handed over to communities with the expectation that those communities will quickly be able to sort of self-organize in ways that lead to positive social and ecological outcomes. I think there may be a need for a longer process of institutional development and adaptation and support for that process, especially if it's requested by those communities. So I guess just the emphasis that where I at a certain point in my career sort of viewed community-based management as something that emerges, and once a community finds a sweet spot and does things well, that you just clap your hands and walk away. But the recognition now that just the world is a dynamic place, and that the institutions and efforts that were needed to sort of generate and initiate community-based approaches, they need to be sort of nurtured and cultivated over time. So I'll finish with that.
Thank you, Professor Jeremy. And with that, we come to the end of round one. So let's dive right into it. My first question in round two, again, is for Dr. Pema Choephyel. And I want to ask if you could talk a bit about specific examples where your project targeted to improve the symbiotic relationship between people and forest or natural resources and environment per se. And what are some of the funding and program priorities for achieving this relationship, which of course we sort of refer to be sustainable?
Yes, thank you very much. Let me start by saying that we tried to do a project in the eastern part of the country, that is in Samjongher area. And this was triggered by community themselves because of the impact of flooding landslides in 2004, where communities really felt that their areas were degrading. So what we did was look at it, visited that place, and found that and identified the environmental stresses. What we found out was that there were 4 areas where natural resources were intensively used by the communities. One was as a fodder and grazing area, which had lots of impact on these saplings of the regenerated forest. The second one was collection of fuel wood, where big massive trees were cut down and used for firewood. The third one was more for broomsticks, household utility, where broom grass were cut off, and it really had an impact on the environment. And the fourth was on the collections of edible crops, or such as we call wangpem, but it is I think Tapestro nutans or Tapestro whitey, which were highly collected during the season for its food value. So these were the 4 things that we had found as environmental stresses due to the communities either collecting or trying to meet their livelihood. So what happened was, we said, why not bring this ecology nearer to the vicinity of the village? The village is called Wuling, where 75 households were there. And the other thing we saw was people were collecting these things because their soils were degrading. Now, because of the sheet erosions and all those things, and there was no replenishment. Of course, I also forgot that one was the collection of leaf molds. So what we did was, we looked at why they started from their own field. Why was the soil being degraded? One was, there were no proper pathways, footpaths, connecting from households to household. This was rather a scattered village or households. So people walking from one household to the other or to the main road were causing the soil to form into rills and gullies. So when the rain came in, these gullies were being washed down and all those things. So what we did was, as a project intervention, we tried to put in 4 things in place. One was establishment of footpaths within the fields of the farmers. Second was growing hedgerows for further containing the erosions along the footpath. And the third one was establishing biogas for households. And the fourth one was plantation of fodder trees. Now, plantation of trees along the common grounds for the villages, and then trying to create an ecosystem in and around the village itself. So these were the 4 things, looking at the environment stresses, establishing interventions at the household or the village level. So what really happened was that the fuel wood, in place of fuel wood, we tried to establish biogas. That entailed villagers to keep the cattle under the shed. So we had to provide funding for construction of shed. So the hedgerows we planted were the broomsticks, which was used as a fodder tree, fodder grass for the cattle in the shade. Then biogas provided the fuel wood for the households. So overall, what had happened was this brought in the transformation of the village in terms of bringing the ecology to their doorsteps. And this was something which was applauded by many of the communities. And the ecology at the forest was saved to a certain degree, because people need not go and collect fuel wood from the forest then, because they had already the gas, biogas in their house. Hedgerows supplemented the fodder grass for the cattle, and footpaths actually prevented formation of gullies and erosions of the thing. Also, the hedgerows prevented the sheet erosions, and the crop productivity started improving. So if you visit this village now, probably you'll see that the trees have grown to a girth of about 1 foot. The village looks totally transformed and beautiful. To me, what really happened here was, this project was brought in from the community through consultation among themselves, and they submitted to us. And the project is well looked after by the communities if they feel there are benefits to them. And that is, I think, the ticket to sustainability of any projects. It is not to push down to them, but rather communities realizing the problems, bringing in their ideas together, and bringing and looking for funding sources. I think this works pretty well. I think the felt needs of the communities will have to be respected, taken care, and of course we can suggest to them the interventions, appropriate interventions, so that they can carry out this thing. Moreover, the project was fully implemented by the communities themselves in consultations, and this helped in trust building among the communities. So this was our lessons that we learned. As far as funding is concerned, I think there are no glitch in the environmental cause funding these days. We could always look for funding sources from many of the international, national entities. And so long as it has benefit to the communities, help in bringing the, saving the forests and natural resources, I think funding should not be that big a problem as far as I envisage. To me, I think 3 things really came out of this project. One is intensive stakeholder consultations, the causes of why things have happened the way it has happened. Nailing down, second is the community becomes very critical for sustainable projects that one takes up. And this really has helped in containing the fuel root extractions. And also Bhutan does lots of incense burning whenever higher authorities come or big religious leaders come. So they cut a load full of incense as incense from trees. And we actually established about thousands of cypress tarulosa for that purpose itself. And this has really transformed. And the broomstick was Thysanolinia maxima. And also as a hedgerow, we also planted this Tupistera nutans and wati, so that they can harvest from the hedgerow itself. And then also it helped in generating some income. But one failure that I saw in this was making brooms from the broomstick by the farmers. They preferred to have it chopped and cut for fodder rather than making broomstick, because it was not their culture to make broomsticks and try to generate income. I had been trying to instigate and convince them that they could earn a lot from the broomstick and can also be an export entity, but it has failed. So this is in short, what we did as a project, and I'm sure if you visit the place, probably this would be more knowledgeable, more learning experience that one could gain. And so this is all about it. Thank you, Dr. Wang.
Thank you, sir. What an exciting and outstanding project. And I'm sure this is just one of the things that you have done. There are many, across the country. A lot of learnings from there. So the next question is for Mr. Ugyen again. And as an NRM expert, what are some of the livelihood options that natural resource managers must prioritize so the well-being of our indigenous communities and the ecology are both enhanced?
Yes, thank you, Doctor. It is a very interesting and important question as well. But, it has been very challenging and difficult to come up with dynamic solution to address the situation in reality. So in the attempt to strike the balance of the economic well-being of the indigenous people and ecological integrity, so through my experience, I recommend that the people's participation in conservation, along with the common agencies, is critically important, as it has been proved in many parts of the world. And in this respect, in order to retain the people in their locality where there's a good environment or the forest, I think we got to explore and promote alternative income sources. And that basically could be ecotourism as well, because it is the non-consumptive resources use. And in that way, it will help to generate employment opportunity for the younger generation. And when I also agree with Dr. Om that ecotourism in many parts of Bhutan has not been that success, but I think we should not remain it there. Rather, we got to strategize in improving the benefit sharing between the tour operators and the communities. And my second recommendation could be like, well, there is a good practice of community-based conservation resource management, and I think we got to strengthen it and empower the local people with a total devolution of power for governance, utilization, and protection of the natural resources. And I think it is very high time, and well, there are only few communities where the payment for environmental service is done in Bhutan. So I think we got to institutionalize the payment for environmental service in recognition of sustainable forest management for the people. And the next one is like, I think we got to promote and support wood-based cottage industry. That is the handicraft and furniture shop, and also the dairy farming and product diversification, which in fact the people will require to use the forest resources, and as a result, farmers will gradually be driven into the plantation of commercial tree species and varieties, as our ex-CEO BTF has clearly pointed out. And it will also, in that way, it will substantiate or supplement the natural resources. And next one is like, I think we need to promote integrated silvopastoral farming. I'm not saying here that there is no practice of silvopastoral farming in Bhutan, but we got to strengthen it so that in that way, local people will be required to involve in land management, and Bhutan government should give the community ownership to the people. And next one is like, we got to have a strong collaboration with the religious institutions and disseminate the significance of interconnectedness between nature and human being. As to uphold the religious belief in sacred groups and practice in respect of our younger generation. And the last one could be like, in Bhutan, human-wildlife conflict is really a burning issue, and we got to harmonize the human-wildlife conflict with dynamic and strategic intervention measures on the basis of situational analysis from the perspective of both wildlife and human being. Otherwise, if this is not done carefully, retaliatory action of victim farmers may result in countering the conservation effort of the government and result to disseminate the wildlife population and damage their habitats. So with this, I come to my end of the answers from my own perception. So if, as I said in the earlier I think like I would request Dr. Pema and Dr. Katel if they can supplement me. Thank you, Dr. so much.
Thus, again, thank you very much for, again, very practical, experiences from your side. My final question for round two now is for Dr. Jeremy Brooks. As a non-Bhutanese NRM expert, but having, experienced Bhutan firsthand, what are your top recommendations for Bhutan's NRM managers or sectors in terms of, what technology policy-wise?
Sure, thank you, Sonam. I just say that first, I'm humbled. I don't necessarily feel like I'm in a position to be giving recommendations to Bhutanese, because I think they're doing better than a lot of other countries in the world in terms of how they're managing their environment. But I can make a few comments based on my experiences. And one thing is, I just want to second Dr. Ohm's response about the sort of generation gap that he sees with his students. And it strikes me that to the degree that the cultural foundations that made conservation in Bhutan sort of possible and made the GNH approach to sustainable development possible, to the extent that that sort of cultural foundation can be maintained, I think that could be critical across all sectors that have to do with the environment in Bhutan. If it heartens you, I do think that I teach, about Bhutan's approach to sustainable development in my own classes, and my own students are always excited and heartened to hear about a place that is taking such a unique and valuable approach to development. So hopefully that's a small solace to you that and I think you're aware of that there's a lot of other countries that look to Bhutan as a sort of guide in terms of an alternative way to develop. But in terms of Bhutan's natural resources sector, I think in my first response, I alluded to the need for support from local governments or NGOs or the national government to help communities develop their capacities and to make hard decisions when it comes to resource management. And I think communities can sort of generate the trust and cooperation that allows them to manage natural resources well, but it's not necessarily automatic. And it's something that I think sometimes has to be cultivated sometimes with outside support. And so I can just draw on one quick experience. And granted, this was over 10 years ago, but in the context of the research I did on the Matsutake, the Sangishamu harvest, I returned a couple of years after my data collection to the communities to present my results and some recommendations. And the message that I had wanted to relay was to the communities was that they shouldn't necessarily leave it up to individual collectors to just do the right thing, especially when there are significant economic incentives to overharvest or to harvest improperly. it seemed to me, my advice was that there had to be some degree of enforcement of the guidelines that the Mushroom Center and the communities themselves had developed, at least until the emerging sort of social norms about collecting the Matsutake became solidified and were internalized. I didn't get the sense from that community meeting that that message was well received or accepted. I know at several times in the meeting, I distinctly remember harvesters or community members standing up and just imploring each other. This was how it was translated to me. To just, we have to have a good heart, to be a good person and follow the collection guidelines. And I think that's a great sentiment. And I think the Bhutanese do have good hearts. But I think, again, cooperation around resource management sometimes has to be cultivated. And that part of that cultivation process is sort of enforcing rules when they need to be enforced, and having the community work collectively to help each other have good hearts and to do the right thing when you're in the forest. And it can't always be just left up to individuals to do that. And I think the government can play a role in that process. And this is particularly true, I think, in probably a lot of communities in Bhutan, where households do have good levels of trust and relationships and are interdependent on each other, because no one wants to be in a position of being the bad guy who reports their neighbor for over harvesting or harvesting improperly, especially when they depend on that neighbor for help when help is needed. But that's why I think that external support sometimes is needed to sort of boost and generate institutions. And I did get the sense from, at least from the communities that I was working in, and this was only two Gaelgs, but that they welcomed support from the government, and maybe in some cases there was too much of a desire for government involvement in the case of Matsutake. But I think, returning to an earlier point, that when giving communities rights and responsibilities and decentralizing resource management, I think that's a good thing, and I think Bhutan is ahead of the game in many respects, and how they've approached community resource management. But I think there's an opportunity to play a more supportive role in sort of helping communities get over that hump of developing those institutions where they hadn't existed previously. And I think I don't have great advice on how to find the balance between playing a supportive role and being so involved that the community just looks to the government to sort of take control again. But also, sort of linking back to my earlier point, I think that this will be an ongoing process. And to sort of return to Dr. Ugyen's point about sort of social and economic and political change in Bhutan, specifically with regard to rural urban migration, right? As people are leaving communities, you're seeing changes in the demographic makeup of communities, and maybe you're depriving them of youth or future leaders, or just reducing population size. And all of that can have an impact on a community's ability to manage their natural resources. And so that additional support, and again, either whether it's from the government or from universities or from NGOs, I think that outside support through that process, that sort of adaptive process, ongoing will be critical. And just one more, one more recommendation. It's not so much a recommendation; it's just further validation for something that Bhutan is already doing. One thing that really struck me in my time in Bhutan was, and this links back to my interest in the cultural evolution literature and the emphasis on group dynamics. I definitely remember farmers in the communities I was working in. If I was looking for them for an interview or to chat with them, several times I'd hear, "Oh, they're out on a study tour," and so they'd go, to another community in Bhutan or in another country to learn how their farmers were doing things or how their communities were managing resources. And I think taking advantage of that variation among communities and giving households and individuals firsthand experience with what the community over the hill or across the valley is doing, that does two things. It both creates sort of a friendly competition, right? Can our community do better at managing our resources than the community over there? But it also creates variation in the strategies that are adopted. And so you might have 5 communities that are managing a forest or managing a certain non-timber forest product, and they come up with slightly different approaches and strategies for doing it. And by having the study tours, they're all able to learn from each other and get a sense of what works best. And I think that's a great tool. That's cultural evolution in sort of happening in front of your eyes. And so I would just sort of reiterate that, you know, if that approach is still happening in Bhutan, as I would suspect it is, that I think that's something that should be continued for sure and strengthened. Yeah, I'm hesitant to say too much more in terms of recommendations, because I think my understanding of your approach to resource management and conservation in Bhutan is that you're ahead of a lot of the world, and we have much to learn from you still. So I'll finish there and pass things over to Sonam.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks. I know it's after midnight where you are, and you're still looking very fresh and keep going with very outstanding tips for us. Bhutan, I think, has been able to do well, of course, as Dr. Pema mentioned, firstly because of enlightened leadership from our kings, but at the same time, we have friends like you across the world who have, wholeheartedly supported us in our endeavor and given us your expert, honest views. So thank you very much, Dr. Brooks, for your time and effort. And thank you also all the panel speakers here today. I think, Joanna, my job is now to summarize.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so without further ado and without taking much time, I'd like to summarize some of the things, take home things from this panel. And I think what is important in our discussion was that the local people's way of life and culture are useful for forest conservation. And lack of these leaves a gap which is hard to fill. And therefore it is bad for the symbiotic relationship between people and forests. And transfer of ownership from community to state is not necessarily the best option unless it's accompanied by people-centric policies and good relationship or good leadership. In absence of this, illegal access may accelerate, which combined with materialistic lifestyle based on consumption could further degrade our forest resources. Local people's disturbance in forest has ecological benefits, such as regeneration, reducing forest fire, and therefore making palatable fodder for wild animals as well. Key threats to the relationship were degeneration of religious belief, conservation-centric rules, rural-urban migration, consumptive lifestyles. And decentralized approach has been talked again and again as one of the best options here. However, strong institutions backed by strong community norms and practices, which are often rooted in religious beliefs, must be present. We have to be mindful about communities where resource management has not been their way of life. And in such cases, outside intervention is key. Community-based management is important in shared resources, especially to balance short and long-term needs. And as mentioned earlier, such intervention must be backed by transparent leadership. The need to reestablish community-forest relationship is important, and community forestry and other examples cited, such as cordyceps in Bhutan, are a way forward to get this going. Livelihood interventions are also a must. Interventions such as ecotourism, wood-based industries are important to generate incomes for local people who have lost access to forest resources. And understanding this interdependence between people and forests must be deepened through teaching. And gross national happiness concept is a good vehicle for teaching this. And this teaching must, of course, be backed by research targeted at impacting policy for sustainability. In terms of funding for all of this to happen, funding must always be based on threats which are urgent. So if that is the case, then we may be able to make impactful interventions to revive the symbiotic relationship between forests and people. And finally, I want to end on a note that people are the face of forest. And if they are suffering, then our forests are suffering. Thank you very much. And I hand over to Joanna.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wangyel, for leading us through this session. It was very insightful and very in-depth. and I'm sure everyone will learn a lot when we do. And I think there are some very helpful recommendations that we can use going forward, not just in Bhutan, but I think also across Eastern Himalayan countries and states. So thank you, Dr. Wangyel. Thank you for joining us from Korea. And thank you, Dr. Brooks, for staying up so late to join us from the US. And thank you, Dr. Katel and Dr. Choephyel and Mr. Namgyel for joining us so early in the morning from Bhutan. Balipara Foundation is honored to have had you and to have had your rich expertise and insights for this. And I would like to thank you on behalf of them. And we look forward to seeing you and working with you in the future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you. Thank you very much.
good to see you all. Yeah.